Hello and welcome to the CameraWise manual videos for the Canon 1300D or Rebel T6. This video is essentially going to go through the camera as an introductory to the camera. It's just going to show you what all the buttons do and how it works in essence. I'll skip over some of it, but don't worry too much because there are going to be videos about nearly every aspect of this camera. So if it seems that I'm not going into any great detail about anything in particular, it's probably because there's a video already produced which will go into those things in more detail and more depth. So let's start off with the top of the camera. You can see here that that's the shutter button, which obviously you press in order to take a picture, but you half press also in order to focus the picture, assuming that you have autofocus on your lens, which we'll go into shortly. This is the main dial, which you can rotate and is a way of navigating around some of the menus and the tabs, and we'll look at that later. This here is the main dial, and this is probably the first thing that you're going to actually do anything with once you've switched the camera on, and the on and off is here, as you can see. And this is because this sets the presets for the camera. Now, if you have moved up from a compact camera or you've just jumped straight into DSLR photography, don't worry too much about this. Just remember that the first four, which is M, AV, TV and P, are the manual settings. They're the settings which we'll go into more detail later on, but they're the settings that you will probably progress to. The ones beyond that really start off with the automatic setting, which means that essentially the camera will sort out everything for you. You literally just point and shoot. Below that there is an automatic setting without flash, which you may want to use if, for example, you're in a museum or somewhere where they don't allow flash photography. The difference between the two is that because the second one doesn't allow flash, it resets the parameters, the ISO and the aperture in particular, and probably the shutter speed to a smaller degree, so that it allows it to take a well-exposed picture without the need for flash. And then we'll go onto a creative mode, which we'll talk about later. And then these, as we go down, are portrait, landscape, close-up, sport, the running man, food, which is quite a nice little additional one. Not many cameras have a food one that's specifically for food. Nighttime portrait, and then the final one you switch over to if you want to shoot video. Now, if we look at the very top of the camera, we'll see here the hot shoe. It's called a hot shoe because it has electrical connectors in it. If it didn't, it would just be called a cold shoe. The hot shoe is really designed for this camera for a flash gun, and the reason it has electrical connectivity here is so that it can advise the flash gun and make it into a dedicated flash, which means that the camera and the flash work in coordination to get the best exposure. We've got a video on that, so don't worry too much about it. In front of that is the camera flash, which will either pop up automatically, or if you press this button here, which has the zigzag on, it will pop up the flash, and there you go. And that will pop up when you want it to, if it's not in the mode where it would flash up automatically. Here you have the internal microphone, and here you have the internal speaker. Neither of them are very big, but that doesn't matter because it's just really for reference, in the sense that when you're listening to it, it's not the full sound that you're going to get out of here. It will sound a lot better when it's on a computer. And then we come round to the back. Now, the buttons on the back are essentially the engine of the camera. They are what give you all the options as to what you want to do. At the top, however, is the viewfinder, and next to the viewfinder is the dioptric meter. Now, that is there so that if you wear glasses or have anything less than 20/20 vision, you can change the view through the viewfinder to suit your eyesight. Now, bear in mind, this does not change the focusing ability of the camera. The camera will focus automatically if it's on automatic focus anyway, but it just means that when it's in focus, you can change this so that it appears to be in focus to you as well, if your eyes aren't, as I say, 20/20 vision. And just so that it makes it easier to do that, you can actually take this eyepiece off, and you've got the full dial access there. It's very simple, and then you can slide it back on again. This, by the way, is also very useful if you want to shoot things on ceilings. When I was on holiday a few weeks ago, I wanted to take some pictures of church ceilings, and to take this off means that it doesn't sit at an angle when it's on the floor, and it sits completely flat. Obviously, you have to be a bit careful, but it worked very well for me, and I'm sure that if there's a moment when you need that, it's always worth remembering. So next to the viewfinder, you'll find the live view button. Now this is the button which allows you to see what the camera sees through the back screen. It's very useful for two reasons. One is it's really useful for composition, and if you press this button, you can hear the lens mirror go up so that the view goes straight through the lens rather than bounces up into the viewfinder. And it's very good because you can see what's in front of the camera and you can compose your image accordingly. It's also, if you have the main dial in video, then it becomes the video on and off switch. Now next is the AV button. Now, if you're in manual, you can change many of the settings. The three main settings are always going to be shutter speed, aperture and ISO. And you can change all of those in manual, and you can in many of the other settings too. But let's talk about manual. If you have it on manual and then you look at the back screen, you will see that the little arrows here, which represent the dial on the top, are on the shutter speed. At the moment here it's on 1/45th, and then it goes to 160, 190, etc. But what happens if you want to change the aperture? Well, you press this button, the AV button, and the rotate arrows go onto the aperture button. So then you're on f5.6, 6.7 and f8. You see that the shutter speed doesn't change, and neither does the ISO. That's because it's on manual, you can change each of these individually. Now, when you're in semi-automatic or fully automatic mode, they all correlate to each other. So if, for example, I was in shutter speed, then my shutter speed would change, so would my F number. So if I go down from 1/45th, then the aperture will go down accordingly, because these are connected, which means that they will respond to each other and they will run accordingly. If it's on fully manual, then I can change these individually and it won't affect the other two settings. So that's what the AV element of this button does, but as you can see, it's got a little square box underneath, and if I turn that to, say, aperture priority, then when you press that, it will turn on to the metering, which means that you can make the camera or the image darker by going down or lighter by going up. Again, we're going to come back to all of these, don't worry. And then finally, there's the waste basket, and you can press that in order to delete things when you're in playback. So we'll come back to that as well. So below that and slightly to the right, you have the display button. Now the display button displays options. It gives you choices as to what you can do, but it also displays what the settings are now. So if you press the display button in here, then you will see that it's on F11, you see the metering, and you see it's on ISO 400. Now, if I press it again, you will see various other things. It's on aperture priority, it's on AF quick, which is autofocus quick, it's on single shot, it's on automatic white balance, and the picture style, etc., and the large JPEG. Don't worry too much, we'll come back to all of this. And it also then, if you press it again, it gives you a histogram, a live histogram of the image that you are looking at. And as you can see, it moves around. So that is very useful information when you're taking a picture, and it's worth having a look at that, and we shall do later on. Next to it is the Q button. Now this is the quick control button. It gives you a lot of information. Again, it gives you very similar information as you're going down here when you are in live view. But if you come out of live view, it will also allow you access to the whole back screen. So if you click it here now and use the cross keys here, then it will allow you to navigate across all of here. And this little box at the bottom gives you a brief understanding of what it is you're in fact looking at. So aperture, ISO, keep going, that's the exposure, that's the flash exposure, which again we'll talk about later on. That's the picture style setting, manual focus, etc., etc., and it gives you all that appropriate information. We'll go through all of this in detail later on, but it's just so that you know what they are and where they are. Now, next to the Q button just below are the cross keys. Now, these are actually really important, not least because each of the four represents something which is very useful to you. First one is the ISO, which will allow you to change the ISO and go beyond 6400 up to high, which is 12.8. Personally, I don't think you'd probably go above 3.2, but if you want to shoot in very low light, this camera is pretty good for that. Let's just come down so I can do that. Next to it are the AF options. So you have one shot, which means that each time you press the shutter button, the camera focuses. It's fine if you're doing portraits or your subject is very still. Next one is AI servo, which means that if you focus with that, then should your subject move, the camera will automatically continue to focus on that subject. And AI focus is kind of in between the two. It's the sort of thing that you would use to focus on something which isn't moving at the moment but may move while you're photographing it. And the camera then itself will decide whether to shoot one shot focus or AI servo focus. Below that, you have the white balance. Oh, white balance, I love white balance. White balance is essentially the setting which establishes within the camera and in the picture what is white. Now that might sound very stupid, but once you've established what is white, all the other colours fall into place. And if you are shooting somewhere which has a colour cast, which perhaps has a lampshade or even fluorescent lighting or lighting with coloured bulbs, then you may not want that colour cast in your image. And to set the white balance is a very useful thing. So it's worth having a look at these. Again, we'll go into them in more detail, and that's a very useful setting to have. It's got a very good automatic white balance setting, so it's not something that you need to set all the time, but it's useful to know how to do. And then finally, on the cross keys anyway, is the single shooting or the shutter shooting options, which means that you can either shoot a single shot or you can shoot continuous. Now, this camera does 3 frames continuous. It's not brilliant, but it's okay. And it also has self-timers, which means that if you're shooting a group and you want to be in that group, you can use this self-timer option to set the timer, run round and be in the picture yourself. It has a 10-second delay, a 2-second delay, and then a 2-second delay, and will shoot as many frames as, well, shoot up to 10 frames, one after the other. Which is quite fun really if you think about it. It gives you an option of doing something silly in front of the camera with your friends. So they're really good. And inside here, the cross keys, is the set button. Now the set button obviously is like the OK button. So when you're going through things, you may need to press the set in order to select an option, and then you will change the option, and then you'll press set again to confirm that selection. So that's what it's for. There are various settings in the camera which will operate either on the cross keys or on this rotate dial. So you could use both, either in combination or separately very often. Now below that you have the playback key, which is essentially the key which lets you see what you have been shooting. So when you take a picture, it will show you automatically on the back what it is, but for a limited period, perhaps 2, 4 or 8 seconds. And then if you want to go back and see what you've shot, your archival stuff, then you press this blue button, and then you can navigate through the various pictures that you've shot and also that you've edited, and also the videos. So that's what that's for. And then we come to the menu button. Now the menu button is really, really important because it gives you access to the settings inside the camera. We are going to go through all the tabs in separate videos, but just to give you an idea of what the options are here and the power of the camera that you've got in your hand. You have got 4 shooting tabs, you've got 2 playback tabs, you've got 3 setup tabs and a custom tab, and that's in stills. And if we move around onto the video setting then and press menu, then we also have 3 video tabs. Now, depending on the settings that you're in, that will dictate what tabs are available to you. If you are on the preset settings, then you will get significantly less or fewer options than if you are on the manual settings. And that's because the preset settings have set many of these options already, and you are not at liberty to change them. But as you go through, you will see that there are various things you can change in terms of file size, in terms of quality of image, in terms of naming the pictures, in terms of setting up the camera, etc., etc. We will go through all of that in a different video. So that's the back of the camera, apart from these 2 lights here, one which represents Wi-Fi, which we'll do a video on, which when it's on indicates that there's a Wi-Fi connection, and then the light next to it which indicates that there is information being transmitted between the memory card and the camera. This comes on either when you're shooting video or when you've taken a picture. It's essentially showing you that the camera is loading the picture onto the card, which is very important. As we come to the bottom, well, you have the card and battery door here. Now, I've done a video on setting up your camera, which is openly available. I thought I could do another one just for the people who bought the manual, but to be perfectly honest, I'd only be repeating myself. So I've given you a link down below this and also here, which will get you through to that video about basic setup. And then here, this is the tripod connector, basically. It's a standard screw fit. So if you buy a tripod, you'll be 99.9% sure that it will fit this camera because they're all pretty much the same. If we go to the other side, then we can see here we have 3 sockets. The first one is for a remote control, which we'll go into later, but it's the sort of thing you might use if you're shooting landscapes or low light photography. The bottom one is an HDMI connector, which means that you can connect this camera straight to a television or monitor so that you can look at your pictures or your videos that much better. And then the middle one is a USB connector so that you can upload your images directly to a computer, should you wish to, if you don't want to put it through a card reader. So that's what those 3 are for. I think that's pretty much the camera. Apart from just a few settings on the lens, which we may as well go through now. This is the kit lens, the standard kit lens. There are only 2 options on here. One refers to focus, and you either have autofocus or manual focus. I leave it nearly always on autofocus. The only time I don't is perhaps if I'm videoing something. In fact, something like this, where the subject is pretty much static, and I don't want the camera focusing all the time, every time there's a small movement in and out. So I will use the autofocus to focus on the subject, and then I will switch it to manual so that it doesn't start refocusing every time the subject moves. But if I'm taking still photography, I leave that on autofocus all the time. The other one is image stabilization. Now this again is very useful. It's designed to help steady the image and the camera. It can be used both for stills and for video, and it's actually quite effective. It's very effective for stills if you have to drop your shutter speed down to, say, 1/30th of a second, which actually below that makes it very difficult to hold the camera steady to take a picture. And it's also very useful for video if, for example, you're taking pictures or videos and moving at the same time. If you're moving forward, for example, if you're walking, this helps to minimize the bounce of you as you walk forward and stabilizes the image or stabilizes the video. Now, the one caveat with that is that if you place this camera onto a tripod, then you should switch it off, because it actually works counterintuitively to a perfectly static camera and can affect adversely the image or the video. But broadly speaking, you leave that on, and broadly speaking, you leave autofocus on. There's plenty to work on this camera, there's plenty to look at, but this was just a quick getting to know your camera video.